I walked into the briefing room and my wife's dad, the SEAL Admiral, smirked. "What's your call sign, Princess?" The men laughed. I said, "Reaper Zero." His face went white. He knew exactly who I was. Look, I've been in some pretty uncomfortable situations in my life. I've flown blind through sandstorms where the visibility was measured and good luck seeing your own hand. I've had my helicopter shot at by people who really didn't want me there. And I once had to sit through a 4-hour presentation about military budgeting that made waterboarding sound like a spa treatment. But walking into that Navy briefing room in San Diego on a Tuesday morning that smelled like burned coffee and decades-old testosterone, that was a special kind of hell that no amount of combat training could have prepared me for. The room was packed, 40 officers, give or take, all wearing their dress whites like they were auditioning for a recruitment poster. The air conditioning was broken naturally because the Navy apparently believes that sweating builds character. Every single one of these guys had that look. You know, the one "they have seen some stuff mixed with I'm about to mansplain tactical operations to anyone who will listen" expression. And standing at the head of the table looking like he owned not just the room but possibly the entire Pacific Fleet was Admiral Conrad Rains. My father-in-law, the man who signed my wedding photos with the enthusiasm of someone endorsing their own death certificate. Now, here's the thing about Conrad. He's what you'd call old military. Not the good kind that respects tradition and honor, but the kind that thinks anyone who didn't serve in Vietnam is basically a Boy Scout playing dress up. He's the type who measures a man's worth by how many push-ups he can do and how loud he can yell Hoya without his voice cracking. And me? Well, I'm the civilian who married his daughter, which in his mind makes me roughly as useful as a screen door on a submarine. I'd been invited to this briefing. And yes, I'm using air quotes so aggressive they could punch through drywall because apparently someone in the chain of command thought it would be a great idea for civilian aviation consultants to observe naval operations. Translation: they needed to fill a diversity quota and I happened to be breathing in nearby. The invitation email had been so passive-aggressive. It practically came with a side of eye roll. Your presence is requested but not required. As we understand, civilian schedules can be flexible. Yeah, real subtle there, Lieutenant. Whoever wrote that. When I walked in, exactly 3 people looked up. 2 of them immediately looked back down at their phones. And the third, some fresh-faced lieutenant who probably still got carded at bars, gave me the kind of once-over that said, "Who's this guy? And did he wander in from the Starbucks next door?" I was wearing khakis and a polo shirt because, newsflash, I'm not active duty anymore, and I'll be damned if I'm going to dress like I'm attending a funeral for fun. Conrad naturally clocked me immediately. His eyes tracked me across the room like a predator watching a particularly unimpressive gazelle stumble into his territory. I found a seat in the back because I'm not an idiot and I know how this works and tried to make myself as invisible as possible, which lasted about 4 minutes. Conrad was in the middle of some speech about operational readiness and maritime superiority using enough buzzwords to make a corporate consultant weep with envy when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Just stopped. The silence was so abrupt that someone's pin rolling off the table sounded like thunder. He looked directly at me and I swear I saw the corners of his mouth twitch upward in what I can only describe as the facial expression equivalent of loading a gun. "Before we continue, gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could rust steel, "I think we should welcome our observer. My daughter's husband has decided to grace us with his presence today." The way he said daughter's husband made it sound like he was identifying a particularly unfortunate rash. "He's here to learn how real naval operations work." The room did that thing where everyone tries not to laugh but absolutely is laughing, resulting in a chorus of coughs, snorts, and poorly disguised snickers that would have made a middle school classroom proud. One guy in the front row actually had tears in his eyes from trying to hold it in. Real professional guys. Top-tier military discipline right there. Conrad wasn't done, though. Oh, no. He was just warming up like a stand-up comedian who'd spotted a heckler and decided to absolutely destroy them for the next 10 minutes. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table in a power pose that probably looked intimidating to people who weren't, actually intimidated. "So, tell me," he said, and I could already feel where this train was headed, and also that there were no brakes and possibly no tracks. "What's your call sign, Princess?" Princess, he actually said princess in a room full of naval officers about a grown man, his son-in-law. The laughter that erupted wasn't just loud. It was the kind of full-bodied slap your knee, nearly choking on your own spit laughter that you usually only hear when someone falls spectacularly on their face at a wedding. These guys were eating it up like it was the funniest thing they'd heard since someone accidentally called the Admiral mom during roll call. Even the serious-looking commander in the corner who'd been frowning at his tablet like it owed him money cracked a smile. I sat there for a moment letting the laughter wash over me like the world's most obnoxious wave pool. I could have gotten angry. I could have walked out. I could have done a lot of things. But here's what you learn when you've actually been in the situations these guys only brief about. Timing is everything. So I smiled just once. A small knowing smile that probably looked friendly enough but carried the emotional weight of a freight train about to derail directly through someone's ego. Then I stood up slowly, making sure every single person in that room was looking at me. The laughter started to die down, not because they were done finding it funny, but because something about the way I moved made their monkey brains go, wait, hold up. Is this about to get interesting? I looked Conrad Raines dead in his steel gray eyes. The ones that had probably stared down foreign adversaries and congressional committees with equal disdain. And I said two words that I knew would detonate like a tactical nuke in that room. Reaper Zero. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute suffocating silence that happens when reality walks into a room and slaps everyone across the face simultaneously. You could have heard a pin drop, except nobody was breathing enough to risk dropping anything. 40 officers. Every single one of them just froze. Some with their mouths still open from laughing. Some with coffee cups halfway to their lips. One guy's pin literally fell from his hand and clattered onto the table. And even that sound seemed too loud. Commander Hill, who I'd noticed earlier because he had enough ribbons on his chest to gift wrap a small car, went completely pale. His eyes went wide and he leaned toward Conrad and whispered loud enough for half the room to hear, because apparently whispering is a lost art. "Sir, the Reaper, the one from Ice Vale." Conrad's face did something I'd never seen before and honestly hoped to never see again. It went from smug satisfaction to complete shock to something that looked suspiciously like horror. All in about 2 seconds. The blood literally drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a fish that had just realized it was actually on a boat and not in the ocean like it had previously assumed. I stayed standing, keeping my expression neutral and friendly. Because the beautiful thing about dropping a verbal bomb is you don't have to follow it up with anything. The bomb does all the work. The room stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 seconds. Long enough for every single officer present to mentally rifle through their service knowledge and connect the dots between Reaper Zero and that absolutely insane mission everyone heard about but nobody talks about because it's classified 6 ways to Sunday. One lieutenant in the back couldn't have been older than 25 made a choking sound like he just swallowed his own tongue. Another officer dropped his folder and the papers scattered across the floor with all the dramatic flair of a movie scene. Nobody moved to pick them up. They were all too busy staring at me like I just announced I was secretly an alien or possibly Batman. Conrad finally found his voice, though it came out about an octave higher than his usual authoritative boom. "You are that's?" He cleared his throat, tried again. "That was you." I nodded once, still smiling, that small, pleasant smile that was absolutely murdering him from the inside out. "Yes, sir. That was me. Ice Vale, February 2019. You might remember it. You ordered the mission despite the abort recommendation. Your SEAL team needed extraction. I was the one who brought them home." I paused. Let that sink in for just a heartbeat. All of them. Through a Category 5 Arctic storm in the dark with a helicopter that had no business flying in those conditions. The room remained dead silent. Someone's phone buzzed, probably a text message, and the sound made 3 people actually jump. Conrad just stared at me, and I watched in real time as his brain recalculated everything he thought he knew about me, the useless civilian, the guy who married his daughter, the man he just called Princess, in front of 40 subordinates. And in that moment, watching his face cycle through every stage of regret, realization, and raw embarrassment, I had one crystal clear thought that made this entire awkward, sweaty briefing room experience completely worth it. This was going to be fun. Let me tell you about my wife, Talia Raines, because understanding her is basically required reading for understanding why her father is the way he is and why I've spent the last 3 years of my life feeling like I'm in some kind of extended job interview that I can't actually fail out of, but also can't pass. Talia is what you'd call intimidating in the best possible way. She's 5 feet 7 inches of pure confidence wrapped in designer clothes and a smile that could either make you feel like the most important person in the world or make you question every life decision that led you to this exact moment. I've seen her walk into a bar packed wall to wall with Marines. And I'm talking about the kind of jarheads who bench press small vehicles for fun and silence the entire room just by raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Not saying a word, just the eyebrow. It was like watching a superpower activate in real time. She works in corporate law, the kind where she wears power suits that cost more than my first car, and casually drops phrases like fiduciary responsibility and litigation strategy while I'm still trying to figure out if I paid the electric bill on time. She's brilliant, funny, doesn't take crap from anyone, and has this way of making you feel like you're the only person in the room, even when there are 200 other people around. When we met at that veteran fundraiser 3 years ago, I thought she was completely out of my league. Turns out I was right. But she married me anyway, which either speaks to my incredible charm or her questionable judgment. I'm going to go with charm because it makes me feel better about myself. But here's the kicker. Despite being this absolute force of nature who could probably negotiate world peace before lunch and still have time to destroy someone in a courtroom by dinner, she has not been able to convince her father that I'm not completely useless. And believe me, she's tried. I've heard the conversations. I've been in the room during family dinners where she's literally listed my accomplishments like she's presenting evidence to a jury. And Conrad just sits there nodding politely while internally categorizing me somewhere between house plant and unfortunate furniture. To Admiral Conrad Rains, I am and have always been that civilian guy who married my daughter. That's it. That's the entire sum of my existence in his universe. Never mind that I have a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. Never mind that I spent 12 years in active service. Never mind that I have more flight hours than most commercial pilots will see in their entire careers. Nope. I'm just the guy who showed up one day, somehow tricked his daughter into marrying me, probably through witchcraft or blackmail. He's still investigating. And now I exist in his peripheral vision like an annoying pop-up ad. He can't quite close. Here's a fun example. Remember Operation Ice Fail? The mission I dropped on him like a conversational grenade in that briefing room. Yeah. Well, here's the part one. Didn't mention the SEAL team I extracted during that nightmare mission. Conrad's team. He was the commanding officer who ordered that operation. I flew through what meteorologists were calling unsurvivable conditions to pull out 15 of his men, including his second in command, who was currently experiencing what medical professionals call actively dying from hypothermia. I brought every single one of them home. Not a scratch. Well, except for Jenkins, my co-pilot, who bit through his lower lip from clenching his jaw so hard during the approach that he needed stitches. But that's beside the point. Conrad sent me a commendation letter, a really nice one, actually. It called me a credit to naval aviation and praised my extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. I still have it somewhere in a box in the garage, probably underneath some old tax returns and a broken blender I keep meaning to fix. But here's the thing. He sent that letter to Major Lucas Vaughn called Sign Reaper Zero. He had no idea that 5 years later, Major Lucas Vaughn would be sitting across from him at Thanksgiving dinner, married to his daughter, being asked if I wanted white meat or dark meat, while he made pointed comments about civilians who don't understand sacrifice. The disconnect is so absurd it would be funny if it wasn't my actual life. This man pinned a medal on my chest. Well, not literally. It was mailed for saving his team's lives, and now he can't remember my first name half the time. At our wedding reception, he introduced me to someone as Tyler. My name is Lucas. I've been married to his daughter for 3 years. We have Sunday dinner together twice a month. Tyler, I didn't even correct him because at that point, what's the point? Let him think I'm Tyler. Maybe Tyler gets more respect. At home, Talia tries to smooth things over because she's an eternal optimist who apparently believes that enough time and exposure will eventually warm her father up to me, like I'm some kind of emotional leftovers that just need a few minutes in the microwave. She'll curl up next to me on the couch, usually after another dinner where Conrad spent 45 minutes talking about naval operations while pointedly not asking me about my day, and she'll say something like, "Babe, Dad just has old school humor. He doesn't mean anything by it." And I'll look at her. This woman I love more than anything. And reply, "Yeah, 1800 school humor. Like pre-elect electricity, old school, pre-indoor plumbing, old school." She'll laugh, do that thing where she scrunches her nose that makes my heart do stupid gymnastics. And then she'll kiss my cheek and tell me not to cause a scene, which is rich because I don't cause scenes. Scenes cause themselves around me. I'm just standing there existing and suddenly everything's on fire and I'm holding the matches without knowing how they got in my hand. But here's where it gets really good or really bad. Depending on your perspective and how much you enjoy watching human relationships implode in slow motion. Conrad doesn't just think I'm useless. He actively tells people I'm useless. At a 4th of July barbecue last summer, I overheard him talking to some captain buddy of his by the grill. They were doing that thing men do where they drink beer and pretend they're not gossiping, but they're absolutely gossiping. Conrad was flipping burgers with the confidence of a man who's never had one turn out dry. And he said, and I quote, "Because this is burned into my brain like a brand, my daughter married a nice enough guy, but he's never really done anything, you know, civilian work, consulting, whatever that means." Whatever that means. I was standing about 15 feet away, holding a bowl of potato salad that Talia had asked me to bring outside, just frozen in place like a deer in headlights. The captain, to his credit, looked uncomfortable and mumbled something non-committal before quickly excusing himself to go check on his kids in the pool. Kids who were very clearly fine and needed zero checking on, but I appreciated the exit strategy. I didn't say anything, didn't confront him, just put the potato salad on the table, smiled when Talia asked if everything was okay, and spent the rest of the afternoon mentally composing resignation letters to this family that I would never actually send because I love my wife too much to let her dad's opinion ruin what we have. But man, it stung. Still stinks, if I'm being honest. The worst part is that Conrad isn't even trying to be malicious. That's what kills me. He's not sitting around twirling a mustache and plotting ways to make me feel small. He genuinely believes that civilian life is less than. That anyone who isn't currently serving or didn't serve for 30+ years is basically playing at life while the real adults handle the important stuff. It's not personal except it is personal because I'm married to his daughter and every time he dismisses me, he's also dismissing her choice to be with me. Talia knows this, by the way. She's not naive. She sees what's happening and it bothers her more than she lets on. I've caught her staring at her dad during dinners with this look of frustration mixed with sadness. Like she's watching someone she loves refuse to open a gift she carefully wrapped. But she also loves her father, respects him despite his flaws and doesn't want to be the person who forces an ultimatum. So she stays hopeful, keeps inviting me to family functions, keeps trying to build bridges between two men who are standing on opposite sides of a canyon, shouting into the void. And me, I kept showing up, kept smiling, kept being polite, kept swallowing every dismissive comment, every forgotten name. Every time he talked over me at dinner or changed the subject when I mentioned my work, I kept it all inside, packed it down, because that's what you do when you love someone. You endure their difficult family members. You play the long game. You hope that eventually something will shift. Spoiler alert, something shifted in that briefing room when I said Reaper Zero and watched 40 officers realize that the princess their admiral had just mocked was actually the legend they'd all heard whispered about in ready rooms and officer clubs. When Conrad's face went from smug to shock to something approaching horror as he connected the dots between the decorated pilot he'd commended and the son-in-law he'd spent 3 years treating like an intern who wouldn't shut up about their study abroad semester. Yeah, the scene definitely caused itself. And honestly, I didn't even feel bad about it. 5 years ago, I was Major Lucas Vaughn. And if that name meant anything to you, it meant you either worked in tactical aviation or you'd heard the stories that get passed around at bars when the beer's been flowing and someone inevitably says, "You think that's crazy?" Let me tell you about this one time. My call sign was Reaper Zero, which sounds metal as hell and absolutely was intentional because when you're flying missions that make insurance adjusters weep, you might as well own the aesthetic. I was a combat pilot specializing in tactical extractions, which is military speak for we need you to fly into places that God himself has marked as return to cinder and pull our people out before they become international incidents. I wasn't special forces, wasn't a SEAL, wasn't one of those guys who kicks down doors with night vision goggles and enough weaponry to arm a small nation. I was the guy who got those guys out when everything went sideways, which spoiler alert is pretty much always. My job was to fly helicopters into situations where the phrase "that's impossible" was less of a warning and more of a challenge I took personally. Mountains and zero visibility. Sure. Active combat zones where people were actively trying to turn my bird into expensive confetti. Why not? Sandstorms that could strip paint off a tank. Just another Tuesday. The mission that made my call sign legendary, the one that got whispered about in ready rooms and officer clubs like some kind of modern military folklore, was Operation Ice Fail. And let me tell you, that mission earned its name because Operation We're All Going to Die Screaming apparently didn't pass the PR review. It happened in February 2019 in the Arctic Circle, which for those of you who've never had the pleasure, is exactly as miserable as it sounds, but somehow worse. Imagine the coldest you've ever been. Then multiply that by "do humans even live here?" and add a generous helping of the wind is physically angry at your existence. A Navy SEAL team had been inserted for what was supposed to be a quick reconnaissance operation. In and out, no drama. Everyone home for dinner. Except intelligence had massively underestimated the number of hostiles in the area, which is military speak for we screwed up and now people might die because of it. The team got pinned down, ran through most of their ammunition, trying to fight their way to the extraction point, and then Mother Nature decided to join the party by dropping a blizzard on them that meteorologists were calling historic and unsurvivable. In the same breath, I was stationed at a forward operating base about 200 meters away, sitting in the mess hall, eating what the military generously called meatloaf, but what I suspected was actually recycled sadness. When the alert came through, the base commander, Colonel Patricia Riss, who was about 5'2" of pure concentrated authority and could make grown men cry with a single disappointed look, called an emergency briefing. The room filled up fast. Every pilot on base crowding in because when the colonel calls an emergency meeting, you show up and you show up fast. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Wind speeds are hitting 120 miles per hour. Visibility is 0. Temperature is -40 and dropping. They have maybe 6 hours of shelter left before hypothermia starts taking them out one by one. The room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet where people are thinking hard about solutions, but the bad kind where everyone's doing mental math and arriving at the same conclusion. This is a suicide mission. Someone in the back, I think it was Captain Morrison, guy who flew supply runs and had never seen combat, actually laughed nervously and said, "You're joking, right? We can't fly in that." Colonel Ricks just stared at him until he physically shrank in his seat. "I'm not asking for volunteers," she said flatly. "I'm asking for pilots who can do the impossible." Her eyes scanned the room and landed on me. "Vaughn, you've flown in worse." Had I flown in worse? Debatable. Had I flown in anything remotely close to this level of meteorological insanity? Also debatable. But here's the thing about being the guy with a reputation. You can't suddenly develop common sense when people are counting on you. It's bad for morale and worse for your ego. So I stood up, stretched like I was about to go for a casual Sunday drive instead of potentially dying in a frozen Hell's Cape and said, "Good news, Colonel. I'm terrible at following advice. And literally everyone's advice right now is don't do this." A few people laughed. Nervous laughter, the kind you hear at funerals when someone tells an inappropriate joke and everyone's too uncomfortable not to react. Colonel Hendricks almost smiled, which from her was basically the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You'll have Jenkins as your co-pilot," she said, nodding toward Lieutenant Danny Jenkins, who was standing near the front looking like he'd just been told he won a prize. But the prize was a one-way ticket to hell. Jenkins was a good pilot, solid under pressure, had a wife and 2 kids back in Virginia, and pictures of them taped inside his locker like a shrine to better life choices. He looked at me with eyes that said, "Please tell me you have a plan." I looked back with eyes that said, "Absolutely not. We're winging this." Because honestly, that was the truth. You don't plan for the impossible. You just point your helicopter at it and hope physics is feeling generous. The flight prep took 45 minutes. We loaded the bird with every cold weather survival kit we could strap down, extra fuel tanks because we weren't sure what the return trip would look like, and enough medical supplies to run a small field hospital. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Ramirez, who'd seen more combat than most people see in video games, pulled me aside as we were doing final checks. "Sir," he said, and I could tell from his tone, this wasn't going to be a pep talk. "You don't have to do this. Nobody would blame you for walking away." I tightened the last strap on my harness and looked at him. 15 guys are about to freeze to death because someone's intelligence report was wrong. If I don't go, they die knowing we didn't even try. I can live with a lot of things, Ramirez. But I can't live with that. He nodded slowly, clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to bruise, and said, "Bring him home, Reaper." The flight out started rough and got exponentially worse with every mile. Jenkins spent the first 30 minutes running through system checks and weather updates. His voice steady and professional, even though I could see his hands shaking slightly on the controls. By the time we hit the storm front, visibility dropped to literally nothing. Just white, endless white, like flying through the inside of a ping-pong ball. The wind hit us like getting sucker punched by a giant, and the helicopter started shaking so hard I was genuinely concerned parts were going to start falling off. "This is insane," Jenkins said, not panicking, just stating a fact like he was commenting on the weather, which technically he was. "We can't see anything. Instruments are going crazy. We're flying blind." "Then it's a good thing I have trust issues with instruments." I shot back, fighting the controls as another gust tried to flip us sideways. "We're navigating by faith, spite, and whatever divine entity finds this entertaining." Jenkins actually laughed at that, a slightly hysterical edge to it. "I'm praying so hard right now," he said. "Like, so hard that God's probably telling me to quiet down because I'm being annoying." "Keep praying," I told him. "But also, keep your hands on those controls because if I pass out from stress, you're flying this thing home." We flew for 90 minutes through conditions that would have made professional stunt pilots quit and become accountants. The helicopter handled like a shopping cart with 3 broken wheels. The instruments were throwing errors like it was their job, and I was navigating based on gut feeling and the occasional glimpse of terrain features when the wind would part the snow for half a second. Jenkins stopped talking after the first hour, which was fine because I needed all my concentration anyway. I could hear him breathing though, fast and shallow, and I knew he was running through all the ways this could go wrong in his head. When we finally found them, it was less tactical precision and more, thank God, we didn't fly into a mountain. The SEAL team had taken shelter in a shallow ravine, and I could barely make out their heat signatures through the storm. Landing was out of the question. The ground was uneven, and visibility was basically a suggestion. So, I had to hover, which in these conditions was like trying to balance a pencil on its point during an earthquake while someone throws rocks at you. The team leader came through on the radio, voice crackling with static and what I'm pretty sure was shocked that anyone had actually shown up. Reaper Zero, is that you? Please tell me you're real and not a hypothermia hallucination. Oh, I'm real, I replied, fighting to keep the bird steady as wind tried to slam us into the ravine wall. And I'm also questioning my life choices. Get your people on board now. We don't have much time before this storm makes the current situation look pleasant. They loaded fast, professionals, even when half frozen and completely exhausted. 15 men, some carrying injured teammates, all moving with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing this is their only shot. The team leader was the last one on. And as he hauled himself into the bird, he looked at me with eyes that had seemed too much and said, "You're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the craziest." "Why not both?" I said, and pulled up before he could answer. The helicopter clawing for altitude through wind that really didn't want us to leave. The flight back was worse than the flight in, if that was possible. We were heavier, the storm was getting stronger, and my arms felt like I'd been bench pressing the sun for 3 hours straight. Jenkins had progressed from praying quietly to praying out loud. A constant stream of "Please God, please God, please." That honestly was kind of comforting because it meant he was still conscious. One of the SEALs in the back was in bad shape. Medic working on him with the kind of controlled urgency that meant time was running out. We made it back barely. I set that helicopter down so hard the landing gear complained, but we were down and everyone was alive and that was literally all that mattered. The base erupted in cheers, people running toward us from everywhere, and I just sat in the pilot's seat for a minute, hands still gripping the controls, trying to remember how to breathe normally. The SEAL team leader found me later in the debriefing room. Lieutenant Mason Rains, though I didn't know his last name, was significant then. He shook my hand so hard I thought he might dislocate my shoulder and said, "You saved our lives. All of us, I don't know how to thank you." I just shrugged. Too tired for eloquence. Thank me by staying alive and doing something worth the risk. He died 6 months later. Different mission, different storm, same commander making the calls. Admiral Conrad Rains, his brother. The universe has a cruel sense of irony sometimes. I met Talia at a veteran fundraiser in downtown San Diego, which is exactly the kind of place you'd expect to meet your future wife if you're the romantic type who believes in fate and destiny and all that Hallmark movie nonsense. I'm not that type. For the record, I'm the type who showed up because my buddy Dave, who I flew with back in the day and who's now working some cushy defense contractor job, guilt me into buying a ticket by saying, "Come on, man. It's for a good cause. Plus, there's an open bar and you literally have nothing better to do on a Saturday night." He wasn't wrong about that last part, which stung a little, but the open bar sealed the deal. The event was at this fancy hotel ballroom with crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my annual salary and waiters circulating with tiny appetizers that looked beautiful but left you hungry 5 minutes later. You know the type, a single shrimp on a cracker with some kind of foam that's supposed to be fancy but tastes like expensive air. I was standing near the bar nursing a whiskey and trying to look like I belonged in a room full of people wearing suits that fit properly. When she walked up next to me and ordered a martini with the kind of confidence that makes bartenders stand up straighter. She was wearing this dark blue dress that probably had a designer name I couldn't pronounce. Her dark hair pulled back in a way that showed off cheekbones that could cut glass. And when she glanced at me, I swear the room got quieter. Or maybe that was just my brain short-circuiting. Hard to say. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she said, a slight smile playing at the corner of her mouth. I laughed, caught off guard by the directness. "That obvious? You've been standing in the same spot for 20 minutes. You haven't touched the appetizers, even though the crab cakes are actually decent, and you're drinking whiskey at a wine and champagne event," she said, taking her martini from the bartender with a nod of thanks. "So, yeah, pretty obvious." In my defense, I said, the whiskey was a tactical choice. Wine gives me a headache and champagne makes me feel like I'm at a wedding I wasn't invited to. She laughed at that. A genuine laugh that reached her eyes and extended her hand. Talia Rains, corporate lawyer, champagne enthusiast, and apparently better at reading people than you are at hiding discomfort. I shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm and confident, the kind of handshake that meant business. Lucas Vaughn, former helicopter pilot, whiskey defender, and guilty as charged on the discomfort thing. I paused, then added, "Rains? Any relation to Admiral Conrad Rains?" Her smile dimmed slightly, just a flicker, but I caught it. "He's my father." You know him? Only by reputation, I said, which was technically true. I knew of him. Everyone in naval aviation knew of him, but I'd never met the man personally. Didn't know then that I'd saved his brother's life or that 5 years later he'd be calling me princess in a briefing room. Life's funny that way. We talked for 2 hours. Just talked about everything and nothing. She told me about her work, the cases she was handling, the frustration of dealing with clients who thought they knew better than their own lawyers. I told her about flying, about the missions I could talk about and the ones I couldn't, about what it's like to transition from military life to civilian consulting where the biggest emergency is someone's PowerPoint not loading correctly. She laughed at my jokes, called me out when I was being self-deprecating, and somewhere around the third drink, I realized I was in serious trouble because this woman was absolutely completely out of my league and I was falling for her anyway. So, what does a former combat pilot do at a veteran fundraiser besides hide by the bar? She asked, swirling her second martini. Mostly wonder why he didn't fake a stomach illness, I said. But also, support the cause. Veterans need resources. Transitioning to civilian life is harder than people think. All that important stuff that I genuinely believe in, but that sounds preachy when I say it out loud at a fancy party. She studied me for a moment, head tilted slightly. You're interesting, Lucas Vaughn. Most guys I meet at these things either try too hard to impress me or spend the whole time talking about themselves. You're doing neither. That's because I'm assuming you're already unimpressed and I'm just trying to delay the inevitable moment when you remember you have somewhere else to be. I said, self-deprecating and honest. Dangerous combination. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and handed it to me. Put your number in. I want to continue this conversation when we're not surrounded by people in uncomfortable shoes. I took the phone, trying not to look as surprised as I felt, and typed in my number. You sure? I should warn you. I'm terrible at texting back promptly, and my idea of a fancy dinner is anywhere that doesn't have a drive-through window. I'll take my chances, she said, taking her phone back and flashing me a smile that made my heart do something stupid and acrobatic in my chest. 3 months later, we were dating exclusively. 6 months after that, I was pretty sure I was going to marry her. And 9 months into our relationship, she said, I want you to meet my father. With the kind of tone that suggested this was both inevitable and potentially disastrous. Meeting Conrad Rains for the first time was like a job interview where the interviewer has already decided you're unqualified, but is going through the motions for legal reasons. We met at his house in Coronado, a beautiful place with an ocean view that probably cost more than I'd make in 10 lifetimes. And he answered the door in khakis and a polo shirt that somehow still looked like a uniform. His handshake was a test, one of those grip-crushing displays of dominance that's supposed to intimidate you into submission. I matched his pressure, held eye contact, and didn't flinch. So, you're the pilot? He said, not quite making it sound like a question. Lucas Vaughn, sir, good to meet you, I replied, keeping my tone respectful but not subservient because I learned a long time ago that men like Conrad respect confidence more than deference. Talia tells me you fly helicopters, he said, leading us into a living room that was decorated with naval memorabilia and family photos that all seemed to feature him receiving awards or shaking hands with important people. Yes, sir. 12 years active service, specialized in tactical extractions and combat support. He nodded, but I could see the dismissiveness in his eyes. National Guard. And there it was, the assumption, the casual downgrade. I felt Talia tense next to me, but I kept my expression neutral. No, sir. Active duty. Flew combat missions in 6 different theaters, mostly the kind that don't make the news because they're classified. Interesting, he said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. And now consulting, aviation safety, tactical operations planning, training programs for private sector helicopter services. Ah, civilian work. He said it the way someone might say mall kiosk salesman or professional mime. Well, it's good you're staying employed. The dinner was painful. Conrad dominated the conversation, telling stories about his naval career that all somehow circled back to his accomplishments while making subtle digs about civilian life and how real service meant 30 years in uniform. Talia tried to steer the conversation to neutral topics, but her father had the conversational agility of a freight train on a single track. I smiled, nodded, answered questions when asked, and mentally calculated how many drinks I'd need after this to forget the experience. At one point, Talia's mother, Elizabeth, a kind woman who seemed perpetually exhausted by her husband's personality, asked me about my most memorable flight. I started to mention Operation Ice Veil, then stopped because I realized Conrad was in the room and the whole thing would get complicated fast. Instead, I told a sanitized version of a supply run gone wrong in Afghanistan. Keeping it light and slightly funny. Conrad listened with half attention, checked his watch twice, and when I finished, said, "Supply runs. Important work. I suppose someone has to do the logistics." Talia's hand found mine under the table, squeezed hard. I squeezed back a silent communication that meant, "I'm fine. Don't murder your father at dinner." When we left that night, Talia was furious in a way I'd never seen before. We sat in my car in her father's driveway, and she just started apologizing, rapid fire, words tumbling over each other. "I'm so sorry. That was awful. He was so rude. I don't know why he's like this. You didn't deserve that. I should have warned you better." I stopped her by kissing her, which shut her up effectively and also seemed like a better use of our time than rehashing how her father thought I was basically a glorified taxi driver. When I pulled back, I said, "Hey, I've been shot at by people who actually wanted me dead. Your dad just doesn't know what to do with someone who married his daughter and didn't ask his permission first. I can handle it." "You shouldn't have to handle it," she said quietly. "Maybe not, but I'm handling it anyway because you're worth it." She looked at me with those eyes that made me want to promise her the world, then said, "I love you. You know that." "I do now." I replied, I meant it more than I'd meant anything in my life. A year later, we got married. The wedding was beautiful. Talia planned every detail with the precision of a military operation, which I found both hilarious and fitting given her family background. Her mother cried happy tears. Her friends gave touching speeches. And Conrad gave a toast that was technically appropriate, but loaded with enough subtext to sink a battleship. "To my daughter's husband," he said, raising his glass with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May his landings be smoother than his career choices." The room laughed. Polite, uncomfortable laughter from people who weren't sure if this was affectionate ribbing or an actual insult. I knew which one it was. So did Talia, who looked like she wanted to throw her bouquet at her father's head. I stood up, raised my own glass, and looked Conrad dead in the eye. "And to my father-in-law, may his next promotion include humility." The laughter that followed was different. Surprised, genuine. A few people actually applauded. Talia kicked me under the table hard enough to leave a bruise I'd find later, but she was also trying not to smile. Conrad's expression flickered between shocked, annoyed, and something that might have been respect if you squinted hard enough. We didn't talk for the rest of the reception, but I'd made my point. I wasn't going to be the quiet son-in-law who took every dismissive comment with a smile. I was going to push back politely, but firmly. Looking back now, that was probably the moment Conrad decided I was either interesting or a problem. Maybe both. Either way, I'd stopped being invisible to him, which was progress. Even if he still didn't know, I was the pilot who'd saved his brother's life. That revelation was coming. Just needed the right moment in a briefing room full of witnesses. The thing about being retired from active duty is that you think you're done with the military, but the military is never quite done with you. It's like that ex who keeps showing up at parties you're trying to enjoy, standing in the corner, making eye contact across the room until you have to acknowledge them. Except instead of an awkward conversation about who kept the good coffee maker, it's official government correspondence with words like requested advisory capacity and your expertise would be valuable, which is bureaucratic speak for we need you to show up or we'll make your life administratively difficult. So, when I got the letter, actual physical mail, because apparently the Navy still thinks it's 1985 and email is a passing fad, summoning me to Naval Base San Diego for a joint operations brief. My first reaction was to laugh. Then I read it again and realized they were serious. The letter was signed by some captain I'd never heard of, but the language was formal enough to suggest this wasn't optional. Your presence is requested as a civilian aviation consultant to observe and provide potential input on tactical helicopter operations. Translation: sit in a room, look interested, maybe answer a question if someone feels charitable enough to acknowledge you exist. I showed the letter to Talia over breakfast, sliding it across the kitchen table while she was scrolling through her phone and eating yogurt with the kind of focused intensity she brought to everything in her life. She picked it up, read it, and her expression shifted from curious to concerned to something that looked suspiciously like she was trying not to laugh. "They want you at Dad's briefing," she said, looking up at me with those eyes that could read a situation faster than most people could blink. Apparently, I took a sip of coffee, which had gone lukewarm, while I'd been reading the letter for the 15th time. Think it's a coincidence with my father? Nothing's a coincidence. Everything's a power move disguised as protocol. She set the letter down and leaned back in her chair. "You don't have to go. You know, you're retired. They can't actually make you do anything." "True," I said, considering it. "But if I don't show up, Conrad wins whatever game he's playing. And I'm petty enough that I'd rather sit through a boring briefing than give him the satisfaction of thinking I'm intimidated." She smiled at that. The kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly how petty I could be and found it endearing rather than concerning. Just promise me you won't start anything. Me start something. I'm a model of restraint and professionalism. I said it with such conviction that even I almost believed it. You told my father his next promotion should include humility at our wedding reception. That was different. That was justified sass. This is just sitting quietly in a room full of naval officers while they talk about things I probably already know. How much trouble could I possibly get into? Famous last words. Truly, if there's ever a documentary about my life, that clip will play right before the dramatic music starts and everything goes sideways. The drive to San Diego took about 40 minutes through traffic that made me appreciate why people pay extra to live near their jobs. I'd been to the naval base before. Consulting work, a few training sessions, the occasional meeting that could have been an email, but someone decided needed to be in person because military culture loves meetings the way toddlers love pudding. The base looked the same as always. Imposing gates, serious face guards who checked my ID like I might be a foreign spy disguised as a slightly tired civilian in khakis, and enough concrete and chain link fence to make you forget that the ocean was literally right there being beautiful and free. I parked in the visitor lot, grabbed my laptop bag, even though I knew I wouldn't need it. Old habits from years of service, and made my way to the administrative building where the briefing was being held. The air conditioning hit me like a blessing as soon as I walked inside. A stark contrast to the San Diego heat that was doing its best impression of the surface of the sun. A young petty officer at the front desk checked my name against a list, gave me a visitor badge that said civilian consultant in letters large enough to be read from space, and directed me to the third floor, Conference Room B. Conference Room B turned out to be one of those large briefing rooms with tiered seating, a massive screen at the front, and enough American flags to stock a 4th of July parade. I arrived about 10 minutes early. Punctuality was beaten into me during basic training and apparently never left, which meant the room was already half full with officers milling around chatting in that permeating way where everyone's pretending to be casual but is actually sizing each other up and calculating who's going to sit where based on rank and social dynamics. I grabbed a seat in the back row, the universal language for I'm here but I'd rather not be, and pulled out my phone to check messages. Talia had texted, "Remember, you promised not to start anything." I sent back a thumbs up emoji, which was non-committal enough to be technically honest. While leaving myself room for interpretation later, the room continued to fill up. I recognized a few faces from my active duty days. Captain Reynolds, who'd put on some weight, but still had that drill sergeant energy. Commander Martinez, who I'd flown with on a training exercise once, and who'd spent the entire flight talking about his boat. A handful of lieutenants who all looked impossibly young and eager in a way that made me feel ancient despite being only 38. None of them recognized me, which was fine. I'd been out for 3 years, and unless you made an impression, good or bad, people moved on fast in the military. Then Admiral Conrad Rains walked in and the room did that thing where everyone suddenly became 20% more alert and 40% more uncomfortable. He was wearing his service dress blues ribbons and medals arranged with geometric precision. His posture so perfect it probably had its own training manual. He scanned the room with those sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. Acknowledged a few senior officers with curt nods. And then his gaze landed on me for a second. Just a second. I saw a surprise flicker across his face. Not huge, just a slight widening of the eyes, a microscon pause in his usual commanding presence. He hadn't expected me to actually show up. Probably thought I'd ignore the summons like a civilian with no respect for military procedure. The surprise disappeared as fast as it appeared, replaced by his usual expression of controlled authority mixed with mild disapproval. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't nod, didn't even let his gaze linger, just moved on to the podium at the front of the room like I was part of the furniture, which in his worldview, I probably was. The briefing started exactly on time because Conrad Rains didn't believe in being late or letting anyone else be late either. He launched into an overview of joint operations readiness, using enough military jargon to make a civilian translator weep. Charts appeared on the screen showing deployment statistics, helicopter availability rates, mission success percentages. It was all very professional, very thorough, and very boring. The kind of briefing where you could feel your soul trying to escape through your ears. I half listened, mostly focused on not falling asleep and embarrassing myself. Around me, officers took notes with the kind of earnest attention that suggested they either genuinely cared or were really good at faking it. Commander Martinez was definitely faking it. I could see him doodling what looked like a boat in the margins of his notepad. About 30 minutes in, Conrad moved on to a section about tactical helicopter operations in hostile environments. This was actually my area of expertise, the stuff I'd done for 12 years before hanging up my flight suit. He was talking about risk assessment, abort protocols, weather considerations, all the things that separate successful missions from smoking craters, and awkward phone calls to families. The key to successful extractions, Conrad said. His voice carrying that authoritative boom that made you want to stand up straighter even when sitting down, is knowing when to proceed and when to abort. A pilot who can't make that call has no business flying tactical missions. I felt my jaw tighten slightly because I knew and he didn't know that I knew that he'd overruled an abort call on Ice Vale. His own brother had been on that mission and Conrad had decided that proceeding was more important than safety. Mason Rains had survived, but the mission had cost them. And 6 months later, Mason died on another operation under similar circumstances. An officer in the front row, young lieutenant, couldn't have been more than 25, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, what about situations where command overrules a pilot's abort recommendation? How do we balance operational necessity with safety?" The room got quieter. It was a good question, the kind that made everyone uncomfortable because it implied that maybe the chain of command wasn't always right. Conrad's expression didn't change, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly. "A commander makes decisions based on the bigger picture," he said carefully. "Sometimes that means accepting calculated risks. A pilot's perspective is limited to their immediate situation. Command has to consider strategic objectives." It was a politician's answer. Technically correct, but fundamentally avoiding the actual question. The lieutenant nodded and sat back, apparently satisfied or at least smart enough not to push further. I almost said something. Almost. The words were right there, loaded and ready. What about when those calculated risks get people killed? But I didn't because I promised Talia I wouldn't start anything and also because the timing wasn't right. If I was going to call out Conrad Rains, it needed to be when it would have maximum impact. The briefing continued. More charts, more statistics, more discussion about readiness levels and deployment rotations. Officers asked questions that were either genuinely curious or designed to make themselves look engaged for the Admiral's benefit. Conrad answered each one with practiced efficiency, the kind that came from decades of briefings, just like this one. And then about 45 minutes in, he did something I wasn't expecting. He paused, looked around the room with that expression that suggested he was about to say something he found amusing, and his eyes landed on me again. "Before we move forward," he said, and I felt a cold sense of dread settle in my stomach because I just knew that whatever was coming next was going to be aimed directly at me. "I think we should properly introduce our civilian observer." He gestured toward me with the kind of casual dismissiveness that was an art form. "Gentlemen, this is Mr. Vaughn, my daughter's husband. He's here to observe and learn how actual naval operations are conducted." The room turned to look at me. 40 faces, most of them neutral, a few curious, one or two with barely concealed smirks because Conrad had just very publicly labeled me as the amateur in the room. The son-in-law who needed to be educated. The civilian who didn't understand real military work. I could have let it go. Could have just nodded politely and let the briefing continue the bigger person. But where's the fun in that? I stood up slowly, making sure I had everyone's attention before I spoke. The room was silent, waiting to see how the civilian would respond to being called out by an admiral. "Thank you for the introduction, sir," I said, keeping my voice respectful but not subservient. "Though I should clarify, I'm not here to learn. I'm here because someone in your command thought my expertise in tactical helicopter operations might be valuable for this discussion." I paused, let that sink in, but I appreciate the warm welcome. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Conrad's expression hardened slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out if I just challenged him or if I was being genuine. Before he could respond, I sat back down. Mission accomplished. The tension in the room was palpable. Commander Martinez had stopped doodling his boat. Captain Reynolds was staring at me with an expression somewhere between impressed and horrified. The young lieutenant who'd asked about abort protocols looked like he'd just witnessed something he wasn't sure he should have seen. Conrad cleared his throat, regaining control of the room. "Well then," he said, his voice carrying an edge that could cut steel. "Perhaps Mr. Vaughn can enlighten us with his civilian consulting perspective." It wasn't a request. It was a challenge, and I just walked right into it. This was it. The moment I could back down, demur politely, say something safe and professional that wouldn't ruffle any feathers. Or I could commit to the chaos and see where it led. Spoiler, I committed to the chaos. Obviously, you know that feeling when you're standing on the edge of a diving board looking down at water that's either going to be refreshing or painfully cold, and there's a crowd of people watching to see if you're actually going to jump. That was me standing in that briefing room with 40 pairs of eyes locked on me and Conrad Rains looking at me like I was a bug. He was deciding whether to swat or ignore. The air conditioning seemed louder suddenly. Or maybe that was just my brain trying to find something to focus on besides the fact that I was about to either cement my reputation or destroy it in front of an audience that included some of the Navy's finest. I stayed standing because sitting felt like retreating. And I'd learned a long time ago that body language is half the battle when you're dealing with alpha personalities who measure dominance in posture and eye contact. Conrad was still at the podium, one hand resting casually on the edge like he owned not just the room, but the entire concept of authority. His expression was neutral, but I could see the challenge in his eyes. The same look a poker player gets when they're holding a decent hand and want to see if you'll fold. Well, he prompted, his voice carrying that edge of impatience that suggested my thinking time was over, and he was ready for me to either impress him or confirm all his worst assumptions about civilians. You mentioned expertise. Perhaps you'd like to share some insights on tactical helicopter operations, specifically how you'd handle a high-risk extraction in adverse weather conditions. Oh, he was good. He'd picked the exact scenario that he thought would expose me as an armchair consultant who talked big but had never actually done the work. The room was watching with the kind of attention people give to car accidents. Horrible to witness but impossible to look away from. Commander Martinez had his pen poised over his notepad like he was about to take notes or draw a cartoon of my humiliation. Unclear which. I could have given him a textbook answer. Could have spouted off some generic tactical principles that would have been technically correct but boring enough to make everyone's eyes glaze over. Could have played it safe. Instead, I decided to tell a story. High-risk extraction in adverse weather, I repeated, nodding slowly like I was considering the question deeply. That's a good scenario hypothetically or based on actual experience. Either, Conrad said. And I caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. That meant he was wondering where I was going with this. All right, then let me tell you about a real one, I said, shifting my weight slightly, getting comfortable because this was going to take a minute. February 2019, Arctic Circle, temperature -40 and dropping. 15-man SEAL team pinned down, surrounded, running out of ammunition and time. Weather conditions were what meteorologists were calling unsurvivable. Winds hitting 120 miles per hour, visibility 0, and a blizzard that was only getting worse. I saw a few officers sit up straighter. This wasn't textbook theory anymore. This was specific enough to be real, and people in military circles loved real stories, especially ones that sounded like they shouldn't have ended well. The base commander asked for volunteers to attempt extraction. I continued watching Conrad's face carefully now because I could see recognition starting to dawn in his eyes. A slow building realization that was absolutely beautiful to witness. Everyone said it was suicide. Every single person with flight experience said the smart move was to wait for the storm to pass. Even though waiting meant those 15 men would likely freeze to death before conditions improved, the room was dead silent now. Even the air conditioning seemed to have gotten quieter. Or maybe everyone was just holding their breath. Commander Martinez had stopped pretending to take notes and was just staring at me with an expression that suggested he'd figured out where this was going and couldn't quite believe it. One pilot said yes. I went on and I could see Conrad's knuckles going white where he gripped the podium because he knew. He absolutely knew what mission I was describing. Flew out with a co-pilot who prayed so hard during the flight that he probably annoyed God. Navigated through conditions that made instruments useless, where visibility was measured and good luck seeing your own hand in front of your face, and where every gust of wind tried to flip the helicopter like a pancake. I paused, let the silence stretch for a beat, 2 beats. Let them imagine it. Let them feel the weight of what I was describing. Found the team in a shallow ravine, loaded all 15 men in conditions that made landing impossible. So, the pilot had to hover, which in a Category 5 Arctic storm is like trying to balance a pencil on its point during an earthquake while someone throws rocks at you. I smiled slightly, remembering Janine's face when we finally touched down back at base. The way his hands had been shaking so hard he couldn't unfasten his harness. Brought them all home. Not one casualty. The mission got classified. The pilot got accommodation. And the story became one of those legends that people whisper about, but nobody can quite confirm. The room erupted in whispers. Officers leaning toward each other, talking in hushed, urgent tones. I heard fragments. Ice veil. That was real. I thought that was exaggerated. No way that actually happened like that. Captain Reynolds was staring at me with his mouth slightly open like I just performed a magic trick he couldn't figure out. Conrad's face had gone through several colors. Red, white, now settling on a pale gray that suggested his blood pressure was doing interesting things. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. That's a nice story, he said, and his voice had lost some of its authority, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like barely contained panic. But it doesn't answer my question about how you'd personally handle. I just did, I interrupted. And you could have heard a pin drop in that room. Interrupting an admiral was career suicide if you were active duty. But I was a civilian and technically couldn't be court-martialed for being rude. That was me. I was the pilot on Operation Icefall. The one who flew through the unsurvivable conditions. The one who brought your SEAL team home when everyone else said it couldn't be done. The whispers stopped. Just stopped like someone had hit a mute button on the entire room. 40 officers frozen in place, processing what I just said. Commander Martinez dropped his pen and it clattered onto the table. The sound impossibly loud in the silence. Conrad opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like he was trying to speak, but his brain had forgotten how language worked. A commander in the third row, Hill, I think his name was, Distinguished Service Cross on his uniform, gray hair that suggested he'd been around long enough to know the legends. Spoke up in a voice that was equal parts awe and disbelief. Sir, you're saying you're the Reaper? The pilot from Icefall. I turned to look at him, nodded once. That's what they called me. Still do? Technically, though, I don't use it much in civilian life because it tends to make people ask questions I can't always answer. But that's Hill trailed off looking between me and Conrad like he was watching a tennis match played with hand grenades. That's impossible. The Reaper is a legend. Half the people in this room think that mission is exaggerated or didn't happen the way the stories say it did. It happened exactly the way the stories say, I replied, keeping my voice level and factual. Probably worse. Honestly, the stories don't usually mention that the co-pilot bit through his own lip from stress or that we were flying on fumes by the time we made it back or that I couldn't move my arms properly for 2 days afterward because of how hard I'd been fighting the controls. Another officer, younger lieutenant in the front row, raised his hand tentatively like he was in school and afraid of getting the answer wrong. What was your call sign? Your actual call sign. This was it. The moment, the perfect setup that I couldn't have planned better if I tried. I looked directly at Conrad, who was still gripping the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and I smiled. The kind of smile that was friendly on the surface but carried the emotional equivalent of a tactical nuke underneath. Reaper Zero, I said clearly, letting each syllable land with weight and precision. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute vacuum of sound that happens when reality walks into a room and kicks everyone's assumptions in the teeth. 40 officers, every single one of them, just froze. Mouths open, pins suspended mid-air, coffee cups halfway to lips. It was like someone had hit pause on the entire world and forgotten to hit play again. Conrad's face went from pale gray to completely white. The kind of white you see on people who've just realized they've made a catastrophic mistake, and there's no way to undo it. His mouth worked silently, trying to form words that wouldn't come. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with what I can only describe as pure horror mixed with dawning comprehension because he knew. Oh, he knew exactly who Reaper Zero was. He'd signed the combination letter himself. He'd read the mission reports, knew the details, knew that the pilot who'd saved his brother's life and 14 other men in those impossible conditions was considered one of the best tactical pilots in modern naval aviation history. And he just spent 3 years treating that pilot like furniture. Had called him princess in front of 40 subordinates not 20 minutes ago. Had mocked his civilian career, dismissed his expertise, and generally acted like I was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. The realization was spreading through the room like wildfire. I could see it on faces, the way eyes widened and jaws dropped as officers connected the dots between Reaper Zero and the guy the Admiral just insulted. Commander, he looked like he might pass out. Captain Reynolds had gone completely still, his coffee cup frozen in midair like a statue. The young lieutenant who'd asked about abort protocols had his hand over his mouth like he was physically trying to prevent himself from saying something that would get him in trouble. Someone's phone buzzed. A text message probably. And the sound made at least 3 people actually jump. A folder fell off someone's lap and hit the floor with a slap that echoed through the silent room. Still, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. Like spectators at the world's most awkward sporting event. Conrad finally found his voice, though it came out rough and strained like he was speaking through broken glass. You were that was you? Icefall was you? Yes, sir. I said, maintaining perfect military courtesy because now that I dropped the bomb, I could afford to be respectful. That was me. February 2019. You ordered the mission despite the abort recommendation from Weather Command. Your SEAL team needed extraction. I brought them home. All 15 of them, including Lieutenant Mason Rains. I saw Conrad flinch at his brother's name, a visible full-body flinch that made him take a half step back from the podium. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched so hard I thought he might shatter his own teeth. Mason was. He started, then stopped, then tried again. My brother was on that mission. I know, sir. He was second in command. Good man. Kept his team calm during extraction, even though he was hypothermic and probably in shock. He shook my hand afterward, told me I'd saved all their lives. I paused, let that hang in the air. He died 6 months later. Different mission. I'm sorry for your loss. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not shock, but something heavier. Grief, maybe. Recognition of sacrifice. The kind of moment that happens when you're reminded that behind all the ranks and protocols and military efficiency, there are actual human beings with families and histories and losses they carry. Conrad swayed slightly, like someone had physically pushed him. His eyes were unfocused, staring past me at something only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, and everyone had to strain to hear it. You saved my brother's life. Yes, sir. And 14 other men. It's what I was trained to do. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time, maybe ever. Not as his daughter's civilian husband, not as the furniture in the corner, but as Major Lucas Vaughn, call sign Reaper Zero, the pilot who'd done the impossible. And made it look routine. And I called you Princess, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with the kind of dawning horror that comes from realizing you've been a complete ass to someone who deserved your respect. I smiled again, that same small, pleasant smile that I'd been wearing since this whole beautiful disaster started. Yes, sir, you did about 20 minutes ago. In fact, right before you asked what my call sign was, the room made a collective sound. Not quite a gasp, more like everyone simultaneously inhaling sharply and trying not to make it obvious. It was the auditory equivalent of watching a car crash in slow motion and being unable to look away. And in that moment, standing there with 40 witnesses who would tell this story for years to come, watching an admiral realize he'd just publicly humiliated a decorated pilot who'd saved his own brother's life. I had one crystal clear thought. This was absolutely completely worth every awkward family dinner I'd endured. If you've never watched a rumor spread through a military base in real time, let me tell you, it's faster than any internet connection and more efficient than any official communication channel ever invented. By the time lunch rolled around, approximately 3 hours after my little revelation in the briefing room, every single person on Naval Base San Diego had heard some version of the Admiral's son-in-law is actually Reaper Zero. And the Admiral called him Princess in front of 40 officers. And it was the most beautiful disaster anyone has witnessed since Lieutenant Morrison accidentally saluted a statue thinking it was an admiral. I knew this because I couldn't walk 15 feet without someone staring at me like I was either a celebrity or a bomb about to detonate. Officers I'd never met nodded respectfully as I passed. Enlisted personnel whispered to each other and pointed, not subtly, just straight up pointed like I was an attraction at a zoo. One petty officer actually stopped me near the parking lot to ask if I'd sign his notebook, which was both flattering and deeply weird. Sorry, sir. My brother was on a deployment and he heard stories about ice fail. And if you're really the pilot, this would make his entire year, he said, looking embarrassed, but also hopeful in that way young service members have when they meet someone whose reputation precedes them. I signed his notebook because what else was I going to do? Refuse and look like a jerk. The kid was practically vibrating with excitement. I wrote, "Stay safe up there, Reaper Zero," and handed it back. And he looked at it like I'd just given him a winning lottery ticket. Thank you, sir. This is incredible. Wait until I tell my squad. He practically sprinted away, clutching the notebook like it might evaporate if he didn't hold it tight enough. I made it to my car and sat there for a moment, just processing what the hell had just happened. My phone was blowing up with texts, mostly from Talia, who had apparently heard from 3 different sources what went down in the briefing room. Her messages were a mix of, "What did you do? Everyone is talking about this. My phone won't stop ringing and Dad won't answer his phone and his aide says he's unavailable. What does that mean?" I called her because texting felt insufficient for this level of chaos. She answered on the first ring. "Lucas Vaugh. What the actual hell happened?" I may have introduced myself properly, I said, trying for casual and landing somewhere around guilty but not sorry properly. Her voice went up an octave. "I've gotten calls from 4 different people. 4, telling me that you announced you were Reaper Zero in the middle of Dad's briefing and that he looked like he was going to pass out. That's a fairly accurate summary." Yes, there was a pause. A long pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone is trying to decide if they're angry or impressed or some combination of both that doesn't have a name yet. "Did he really call you Princess?" "Oh, yeah." In front of 40 officers asked me what my call sign was. Very condescending tone, clearly expecting me to either not have one or to say something civilian and boring. So I told him another pause. Then unexpectedly, she laughed. Not a small laugh either. A full, genuine, almost crying laugh that went on for a solid 10 seconds. Oh my God. Oh my God. Lucas, do you have any idea what you've done? Introduced myself. You've humiliated a 3-star admiral in front of his entire staff. He humiliated himself. I corrected. I just provided context. She was still laughing. That kind of laughter that borders on hysteria. My dad is never going to recover from this. This is going to follow him for the rest of his career. Do you know how many people have been waiting for something like this to happen? He's been so smug for so long. And now she broke off into another fit of laughter. Are you okay? I asked, genuinely concerned now. I'm great. This is the best thing that's happened in years. I love you so much right now. She was definitely crying with laughter at this point. I wish I could have seen his face. It was pretty spectacular. I admitted he went through about 6 different colors. I'm pretty sure his blood pressure hit numbers that medical science didn't think were possible. I can't believe you actually did it. I told you not to start anything. I didn't start anything. Your dad asked me a direct question. I answered it very politely, I might add. I was a model of military courtesy throughout the entire exchange. You're impossible, she said. But she was still laughing, so I figured I wasn't in too much trouble. Okay, I have to go. I have 3 more calls coming in and one of them is from Mom, which means this has reached peak family drama levels. Come home tonight and tell me everything, every single detail. I want the full story with all the reactions. Will do. Love you. Love you too, you beautiful chaos agent. She hung up and I sat there in my car, air conditioning blasting, watching naval personnel walk by and occasionally glance at my car like they knew who was inside. This was surreal. This was absolutely completely surreal. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Sir, this is Lieutenant Grace Moore, Admiral Rain's aide. The Admiral requests that you remain on base for the afternoon. He'd like to speak with you privately at 1500 hours. His office, Building 12, 3rd floor. I stared at the message. Requests? Sure. When an admiral requests something, what he means is do this or there will be consequences. I texted back, I'll be there. The response came immediately. Thank you, sir. I had 3 hours to kill, so I went to the base commissary and grabbed lunch. A surprisingly decent chicken sandwich and some chips that were definitely stale, but I ate them anyway because stress eating is a valid coping mechanism. The commissary was packed with the lunch rush, and I swear at least a dozen people recognized me. The conversations would stop mid-sentence when I walked by, then resume urgent whispers the moment I passed. At one table, I overheard 2 lieutenants talking. Heard he flew through a Category 5 storm. Impossible. The helicopter would have been torn apart. Saved 15 SEALs, including the Admiral's brother, and the Admiral didn't know. How did he not know? I kept walking, found a corner table, and ate my sandwich while pretending to read emails on my phone. In reality, I was trying not to think about the conversation I was about to have with Conrad in approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. After lunch, I wandered around the base, killing time. Stopped by the aviation hangar because old habits die hard and I can't resist looking at helicopters even when I'm not flying them anymore. The hangar was massive, housing about a dozen birds in various states of maintenance. The smell hit me immediately. Jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, metal, and something else that's hard to describe, but that every pilot knows instinctively. It's the smell of readiness, of potential, of machines that can kill you or save you depending on how you treat them. A crew chief was working on one of the birds. A young woman with her sleeves rolled up and grease on her hands. She glanced up when I approached, did a double take, and her eyes went wide. You're him, she said. Not a question. I'm someone, I replied diplomatically. Reaper Zero. Everyone's talking about it. You really flew Ice Veil. She stood up, wiping her hands on a rag that looked like it had never been clean in its entire existence. I did. She looked at the helicopter she'd been working on, then back at me. What's it like flying in conditions like that? I mean, I've flown through some bad weather, but nothing like what the stories say about Ice Veil. I considered the question honestly terrifying. Every instinct you have is screaming at you to turn around, to land, to do anything except keep flying forward. Your instruments are lying to you. Your body is lying to you. And the helicopter is fighting you every second. You're not flying so much as negotiating with physics and hoping it doesn't decide to kill you. She nodded slowly, absorbing that, but you kept going. People were depending on me. That's the job. You don't get to quit just because it's hard. I looked at the bird she was maintaining, recognized it as one of the newer models. You take good care of this one. Someone's life might depend on your work someday. Yes, sir, she said, straightening up a little. I will. I left the hangar feeling oddly emotional, like I just passed some kind of torch I didn't realize I was carrying. The military does that. Makes you feel connected to people you've never met. Part of something bigger than yourself, even when you're technically not part of it anymore. At 1,445 hours, I made my way to Building 12. The receptionist on the third floor recognized me immediately. Not surprising given that my face was probably the most discussed topic on base today, and directed me to wait in a small conference room adjacent to the Admiral's office. The room was sterile and professional, with a table, 6 chairs, and a painting of a naval battle that looked historically significant, but that I couldn't identify. I sat down and waited. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling like an hour. I wasn't nervous exactly, but I was definitely feeling something. Anticipation maybe, or the kind of tension that comes before a conversation you know is going to be significant. At exactly 1,500 hours, the door opened and Admiral Conrad Rains walked in. He looked older than he had this morning. Not physically older, but worn down, like someone had taken sandpaper to his usual confidence and authority. His uniform was still perfect, his posture still military straight, but something in his eyes was different. Vulnerable, maybe human. He closed the door behind him, stood there for a moment like he was gathering his thoughts, and then said, "I owe you an apology." I hadn't been expecting that, not even a little bit. I'd been prepared for anger, for defensiveness, for him to try to spin the situation into something that wasn't entirely his fault. But an apology from Conrad Rains, that was like seeing a unicorn do taxes. Theoretically possible, but practically unheard of. "Sir," I started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. And for the first time since I'd met him, he looked directly at me like he was seeing me instead of looking through me. "I called you Princess. I dismissed your expertise. I've spent 3 years treating you like you were an inconvenience rather than a person, let alone the person who saved my brother's life. And I did all of that because I was too arrogant and too stubborn to see past my own biases about civilian life and what it means to serve. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Just listened. Mason talked about you." Conrad continued, his voice getting quieter. "After Ice Veil, he said the pilot who extracted them was the bravest person he'd ever met. Said anyone who could fly through those conditions and bring everyone home was someone special. He never told me your name. Classified mission. Couldn't share details, but he said if he ever met you again, he'd buy you every drink in whatever bar you were in." My throat tightened. I'd known Mason Rains for exactly 4 hours, the flight back from Ice Veil, and the brief time afterward, but in that time, he'd been professional, grateful, and kind. Learning that he'd talked about me, that he'd thought of me after hit harder than I expected. "He was a good man," I said quietly. "He was, and I got him killed 6 months later by making the same mistake I made with Ice Veil, ordering a mission to proceed when it should have been aborted." Conrad's eyes were shining now. Not quite tears, but close. "I've been carrying that guilt for 5 years. And then you walked into my daughter's life. And instead of seeing you, I saw a reminder of everything I've done wrong. So I pushed you away, dismissed you, made you into something small so I wouldn't have to confront how big my failures were." The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, someone was shouting drill commands. "I don't know if you can forgive me," Conrad said. "I don't know if I deserve it, but I want you to know that I see you now. Major Lucas Vaughn, Reaper 0, the man who saved my brother and 14 other men, and the man my daughter chose to marry, which means she saw something in you that I was too blind to see." I took a breath, let it out slowly. "Sir, I'm not going to pretend the last 3 years haven't been frustrating. They have been. But I also understand that grief makes people do things that don't make sense. You lost your brother. That's not something you just get over." "No," he agreed. "But it's also not an excuse to treat people badly." "No, it's not," I said, because honesty seemed important here. "But it's a reason, and reasons matter," he nodded. "Seemed to consider that. Can we start over? Not forget the past, but maybe build something better going forward." I thought about it. Thought about Talia, about family dinners, about the possibility of not feeling like an outsider every time I walked into a room with Conrad Rains in it. "Yeah," I said, "finally, we can do that." He extended his hand across the table. I took it. His grip was firm, respectful, nothing like the dominance-testing handshake from our first meeting. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome, sir." We sat there for another minute, neither of us quite ready to leave, both of us processing what had just happened. Finally, Conrad stood up, straightened his uniform in that automatic way military people do, and gave me a small smile. For what it's worth, Princess might be the worst call sign guess in naval history. I laughed, surprised. Yeah, it really was. Reaper Zero, though, that's one hell of a name. Earned it the hard way. The best ones always are. He left and I sat there alone in the conference room feeling like something significant had shifted. Not fixed. You don't fix 3 years of tension in one conversation but shifted. Like maybe possibly there was a path forward that didn't involve constant low-level warfare at family dinners. My phone buzzed. Talia. Well, did he kill you? Are you alive? Should I start planning a funeral? I texted back. Still alive? Actually had a good conversation. Tell you about it tonight. Her response was immediate. A good conversation with my father. Are you sure you're talking to the right person? Pretty sure he apologized and everything. I don't believe you. This is a prank. You're pranking me, not a prank. Real life. Apparently, I broke something loose. You broke my father loose. I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified. Go with impressed. I'm going with impressed. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. The San Diego sun setting behind me in shades of orange and pink that looked almost unreal. The base gates receded in my rear view mirror and with them some weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Turned out sometimes the best thing you can do is tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. Even if those chips are an Admiral's ego that night, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ice Vale than what I remembered, more to Mason's death than bad luck and timing. So, I did something probably illegal. I accessed the classified mission archives using credentials that technically hadn't expired yet, even though I definitely shouldn't have been using them anymore. The file room was digital now, thankfully, because breaking into an actual physical archive would have required skills I didn't have and a willingness to commit felonies I wasn't quite ready for. I logged in, pulled up Operation Ice Vale, and started reading through reports I'd never seen before. Command logs, weather data, communication transcripts, and there it was, buried in a communication log timestamp 20 minutes before we launched. Pilot Vaughn requests mission abort due to unsurvivable weather conditions. Request denied by Commander Rains. Proceed with extraction as ordered. Conrad had overruled my abort call. I'd forgotten that detail, buried it under the adrenaline and chaos of the actual mission. But there it was in official records, proof that I tried to stop the mission and he'd forced it forward anyway. 3 weeks later, we both got summoned to a review board. Someone had noticed my file access. Of course, they had. And now the Navy wanted answers. The hearing room was cold, filled with senior officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Reviewing anything else besides a 5-year-old mission that was supposed to stay buried. They asked me directly, "What did you find in those files, Major Vaughn?" I could have lied. Could have said I was just reminiscing. Instead, I told the truth. Radar data was altered post-mission. My abort request was denied and then scrubbed from preliminary reports. 2 men died on subsequent missions using the same flawed decision-making process. One by storm, one by ego. The room went silent. Then Conrad stood up, looking 10 years older than he had 3 weeks ago. "He's right," Conrad said, voice steady despite everything. I overruled that abort call. My brother Mason survived Ice Vale, but I got him killed 6 months later making the same mistake. I thought leadership meant never backing down. I was wrong. I looked at him, then at the board. Don't strip his rank. Make him teach what he learned. Let him show others what arrogance costs before it costs them everything. They agreed. Progress over punishment. For once, the Navy chose growth. A year later, I attended a training program graduation at the same base where everything started. The banner read, "Leadership Under Fire, Learning from Failure." Conrad stood at the podium, grayer but somehow lighter, and addressed a room full of young officers. "I once mocked a man who taught me the hardest lesson of my career," he said. His call sign was Reaper Zero. His lesson, real command starts when you admit you're wrong. The applause was genuine. Real. I actually clapped this time. No pettiness required. Afterward, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a note from Mason written after Ice Vale to the pilot who brought me home. "Tell my brother I saw heaven once. It was made of ice and rotor blades. Thank him for sending you. He forgave you first," I said quietly. Conrad nodded, tears in his eyes. "And you already did. Just wanted to see you work for it a little." We both laughed. Awkward. Real human. Later, the Navy unveiled a new helicopter model, RZ-01, named after me. When they asked for a speech, I simply said, "You call me Princess. Now your fleet's named after me." I'd call that character development. The crowd roared. Above us, the Reaper gleamed gold in the sunset. Finally, the sky felt like home.